Most of what we think we know about the Minoans traces back to a script we cannot read. Linear A, the writing system used across Crete and the wider Aegean during the Bronze Age, has left around 1,500 surviving inscriptions. Clay tablets, stone offering tables, potter's marks fired into ceramic. We can date these objects. We can count their signs. We can even pronounce many of them, because roughly 60 or 70 signs appear to have been carried directly into Linear B, which Michael Ventris deciphered in the early 1950s. But pronouncing sounds is not the same as understanding a language. The language underneath Linear A is opaque to us, not partially opaque, not getting closer opaque, fully opaque. This is a story about what happens when the writing survives and the language dies with no living relatives and no key left behind. Most of the Linear A corpus comes from a handful of sites on Crete. The largest single concentration, a few hundred tablets, comes from the palatial administrative complex at Hagitraiata in southern Crete, recovered in early 20th century excavations. Smaller caches turn up at Malia, Zakros, and Akrotiri on Thera, along with isolated finds from other Aegean islands and a few points on the Anatolian coast. That distribution tells us something. This was not a purely local script. It traveled with Minoan trade and administrative networks. The tablets themselves are clay unbaked, which means they survived only where fires accidentally baked them during site destructions. The content, as far as sign patterns and pictographic context can establish, is overwhelmingly economic. Inventories of livestock, grain, and what appear to be textiles. Tallies attached to commodity logograms, the sign for an ox, a vessel, an agricultural product. The number signs are transparent and match their Linear B equivalents. We can read the quantities. We can read the commodity type. We cannot read the words that name who provided it, who received it, or on whose authority it was recorded. There are also stone libation tables, flat inscribed objects recovered from peak sanctuaries and cave sites, which some researchers interpret as having ritual or dedicatory content rather than purely economic content. The interpretation is contested, and the evidence for ritual function is mostly contextual. The format of the objects, the locations where they were deposited. This is a recurring feature of the Linear A problem. We infer content from context, because the language won't confirm or correct us. The best tool we have for approaching Linear A is the relationship to Linear B, and it is both useful and frustrating in roughly equal measure. Linear B was adapted from Linear A, or possibly from a shared ancestor, by Mycenaean Greek speakers who were using writing to administer their palace economies from around the mid-14th century BCE. When Ventris deciphered Linear B in the early 1950s, working from large tablet archives found at Knossos and on the Greek mainland, he demonstrated that the underlying language was an archaic form of Greek. That was a genuine scholarly surprise. Many researchers before him had assumed the language would be something non-Greek. The decipherment worked because Greek is a known language. Ventris could apply proposed phonetic values to signs, try combinations, and test whether the results resembled recognizable ancient Greek forms. A feedback loop between sound and vocabulary allowed the system to open. Linear A has roughly 60 to 70 signs that appear visually related or equivalent to Linear B signs. The standard approach is to apply the Linear B phonetic values to those borrowed signs and see what words emerge. This produces partial phonetic readings of Linear A texts. Some of these readings yield plausible personal names and place names, words that look like they could be Minoan proper nouns when read with Linear B phonetics. A few word forms recur across tablets in patterns consistent with administrative vocabulary. And that is roughly where progress stops. The problem is that Minoan is not Greek, almost certainly not related to Greek at all. So even if the borrowed signs carry approximately correct phonetics, there is no language to test the results against. You can reconstruct the sounds without understanding a syllable of meaning. It is the difference between knowing what someone's voice sounds like and understanding what they said. Most of the famous ancient script decipherments depended on a bilingual or multilingual text. Egyptian hieroglyphics opened up because the Rosetta Stone gave the same decree in Greek, Demotic Egyptian, and hieroglyphic script. Mesopotamian cuneiform was cracked partly through trilingual Achaemenid inscriptions carved into a cliff face in western Iran. In each case, the method is the same. You have one side you can read and one side you can't, and you use the known to unlock the unknown. Linear A has no equivalent. No surviving text gives us Minoan content in a language we already know. The Minoans participated actively in Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean trade networks. Minoan objects and artistic motifs turn up in Egypt, in the Levant, in Cyprus. But if that commerce produced bilingual documents, none have been found. The second structural problem is the nature of the surviving corpus. Administrative tablets don't repeat much vocabulary across varied contexts. That is fine if you already know the language. You can confirm your readings against the grammar you already possess. It is a serious problem if you don't, because the narrow formulaic register doesn't give enough variation to triangulate meaning from distribution alone. Computational approaches have been applied. Researchers have run statistical analyses on sign patterns, looking for grammatical regularities, comparing suffix distributions to candidate language families. This work has produced some structural hypotheses about how Minoan grammar may have worked. Certain suffixes appear to behave like case or number markers, but knowing a suffix might mark plurality doesn't tell you what any word means. You've found the grammar bones. The vocabulary is still gone. The question of Minoan's linguistic affiliation has attracted serious scholarship and, periodically, less serious claims. The honest shape of the serious debate looks like this. Minoan is almost certainly not Indo-European. The Indo-European family, which includes Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and most of the languages you'll know, has structural signatures that show up consistently across its members. Researchers have tested Minoan vocabulary fragments against reconstructed Indo-European roots. The results have not convinced the broader scholarly community. The same applies to known Semitic languages. Bronze Age merchants from the Levantan coast, Egypt and Cyprus were trading with Crete. If Minoan were Semitic, we'd expect some recognizable cognates to surface when we apply linear B phonetics to the shared signs. They haven't surfaced consistently enough to make the case. A hypothesis that recurred through 20th century scholarship proposed a connection to pre-Greek languages spoken on Aegean islands and the Anatolian coast before Indo-European populations moved in. The logic is reasonable. The Aegean and Anatolian coasts were closely linked, and some Anatolian languages from the period are attested, though not well understood. Structural parallels have been argued, but this remains a minority position. The most defensible current position, as far as the mainstream of research stands, is that Minoan is a language isolate. No known relatives, living or dead. That does not mean it had no relatives. It means any relatives, if they existed, left insufficient written record to be identified. A language isolate is a particularly difficult object to decipher. Without a related language to supply a vocabulary anchor, you need either a bilingual text or a corpus vastly larger than what we have. Minoan has neither. What makes linear a genuinely different from most famous unsolved scripts is not the absence of a solution so far. It's the structure of what a solution would require. The scripts that have been deciphered over the past 2 centuries almost all followed one of 2 paths. Either a bilingual key was found, or the underlying language turned out to be a member of a known family that could serve as an anchor. Linear B opened because of Greek. Ugaritic cuneiform opened partly because of its relationship to Semitic languages scholars already knew. Even difficult cases where no bilingual text existed were helped enormously when linguists had a family to work from. Linear A offers neither, and the inscriptions are too short and too uniform in register to support the statistical methods that sometimes work on larger and more varied corpora. 1,500 inscriptions sounds like a lot until you compare it to the tens of thousands of linear B tablets that gave Ventris enough material to work, and Ventris still needed Greek as his anchor. The honest answer to can linear A be deciphered is not by current methods, and probably not until something new turns up in the ground or in an archive. A bilingual text, even a short one, even a merchant receipt that happens to be written in both Minoan and a known language, would transform the situation overnight. A new cache of longer inscriptions with varied content would help. None of these are impossible. Aegean archaeology is still active. But the work being done now on sign distribution and grammatical structure, while genuinely rigorous, is building a framework that can only be filled in when better evidence arrives. The framework itself can't decipher the language. The limits here are worth naming directly because they're easy to paper over. We don't know whether the surviving inscriptions are representative of Minoan writing as a whole. Everything we have comes from contexts where clay happened to be fired by accident palace destructions mostly. If the Minoans wrote on organic materials, wax tablets or papyrus or treated leather, none of that survived the Aegean climate. The bureaucratic record we have may be a thin slice of a wider written culture. There may have been literature, religious texts, correspondence. We have no way to know. We don't know the phonetic values of all linear assigns. The borrowed signs give partial coverage. The signs unique to linear A, those not carried over into linear B, have no established phonetic values. They may represent sounds that Mycenaean Greek lacked and therefore didn't need to borrow. We don't know what happened to Minoan as a spoken language after around 1450 BCE, when Mycenaean Greek appears to have replaced Minoan administrative culture on Crete. Did Minoan survive as a spoken tongue for generations after the script stopped being used? Did it survive in pockets, mixed into local dialects? The linguistic record ends where the tablets end. What people were saying in ordinary life a century after the last clay tablet is unknown. And we don't know whether linear inscriptions represent a single Minoan language or a group of regional dialects that shared a script. The inscriptions show variation across sites. Interpreting that variation as dialect difference versus scribal practice versus random noise requires knowing the language, which we don't. The Minoans left us their receipts and their tallies, around 1,500 pieces of administrative paperwork from a civilization sophisticated enough to need paperwork. What they believed, how they argued, what their priests said over the offering tables, that record is gone and it may stay gone. What survives is what was useful to the palace economy: quantities of sheep, jars of oil, bolts of cloth. What survives is often what was useful to power, not what was true. If a piece of this story changed your mind or didn't, that's the point. I'm Marcus. Until next time.